Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2, and today I'm going to be showing you guys a nearly perfected version of a Bone Spear Necromancer, which in my opinion is the overall best Necromancer build in Season 2. But I also happen to have spent a ton of time setting up Blood Surge Necromancer. I tried to make it as good as I possibly could. Unfortunately, it just isn't possible to make Blood Surge as good as Bone Spear is, but it's still very good and capable of doing tier 100 Nightmare dungeons. The main problem with Blood Surge is that you just can't kill bosses quickly. And I really wanted to make a build that would work for the Abattoir of Zir, and Blood Surge just isn't it. But Blood Surge is a lot of fun to play. You can easily do tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons, as you can see, and it's probably one of the best leveling builds in the game. So for those of you guys that are interested in it, I'll talk more about it at the end of the video. But for now, we're going to talk about Bone Spear, which is overall just the most versatile Necromancer build in the game. It has insanely high damage output, easily doing well over about 10 million damage per Bone Spear when you account for all of the splinters hitting the same target. Absolutely just blasting bosses, and the build isn't even set up specifically for bossing. You have more than enough survivability to comfortably just fly through Nightmare dungeons, even in a tier 100 setting, and it's by far the fastest build that Necromancer has access to, and I don't even really think it's close. It's also personally one of my favorite builds to play with, as Bone Spear is just super satisfying, and it feels really nice just sucking in a bunch of dudes with corpse tendrils and then just blasting them in the face, one-shotting them out of existence. Because it is Necromancer's highest damaging output build, this is what I personally think will be the best build for the Abattoir of Zir if speed ends up being very important. Otherwise, I think Infinimus is probably your second best option, but I personally am really not a fan of how slow that build is and the playstyle in general. Before we get into the build, I want to give a big thanks to today's sponsor, Geology. One of the leading skincare hygiene brands with over 7,000 5-star reviews, you can trust Geology to drastically improve your skin health, especially given that Geology actually uses ingredients that are backed by facts, so you know you're getting a product that is definitely going to work for you, such as their Dark Circle Eye Cream, which is an absolute must for us degenerate gamers that stay up way too late. Using the link below, you can take a personalized quiz that will create the perfect routine customized just for you that's super simple to follow and extremely effective. I'm also a huge fan of their aluminum-free deodorant and bergamot body wash, which both smell fantastic. For a limited time, you can get a massive 70% off their skincare trial set if you use my link, but you'll also get an additional offer for up to 30% off of any add-ons with your purchase, so make sure to check out the link in the description and fix your degenerate gamer hygiene today. Alright, getting into the build, there's quite a lot of different things that you can swap around for minor differences in the build and a little bit of variations that you may see from different creators here and there. I'll try to mention all of them and which scenarios you'd like to use them in and why you may want to swap things around. I'm going to be pretty diligent, but let's also try to not be too long here. There'll also be a build link in the description. I'm now partnered with Mobilytics, so all of my builds in the future will be posted over on Mobilytics, and I will have all of the variations posted there for you guys. So a uber unique variation, a lidless wall variation, a no uber unique variation, and leave it down in the comments if there's a specific variation that I left out that you would like to see. But getting into things, I'm sure a lot of you guys have already played a Bone Spear Necromancer build, so you get the gist, but Bone Spear is just ridiculously strong on its own, and there's a ton of ways to scale its damage. Basically, your goal is to get maxed out critical hit chance because there's so many different crit damage modifiers that you can take advantage of, such as Corpse Tendrils, Grasping Veins giving you 80% crit damage modifier when it is on a two-hander, Ossified Essence giving you 60% crit damage modifier, or 40% if it's just on your gloves. You have Book of the Dead Iron giving you 30% increased crit damage, but you also get a lot of additional damage by scaling up your maximum essence with the Ossified Essence key passive. You also get a lot of damage via here with a Compound Fracture, Serration giving you crit chance, and Evulsion giving you even more crit damage. Outside of that, we get a ton of additive crit damage in the Paragon Board here, so basically our goal is to get as close to 100% crit chance as humanly possible, and then crit as much as possible so that we can take advantage of all these different modifiers, which just does a ridiculous amount of damage. Also, because we're using the modifier where Bone Spear has increased crit chance, and then if it does crit, it fires 2 additional bone shards. Paired with the splintering aspect, the bone shards actually do a pretty significant amount of your damage, and this pretty much enables you to do upwards of 10 million damage per hit. So as you can see here, if I don't crit, I do like literally 0 damage, but I get a Corpse Tendrils down, and then I crit, and as you can see, you just absolutely pipe out damage. And as long as you're critting, which you should be able to almost all the time, you do very, very good damage with this build. Upwards of like 4 million damage with just one individual hit, 6 million there with an overpower. The damage is pretty insane. The rest of our skills, we want to use one basic skill, not because of the essence generation. We will have more than enough passive essence generation with the build, which is very easy to solve. You are using this because you want to use a basic skill every 6 seconds if you have the aspect of might for 20% damage reduction. But Reap is also very good because it's going to guarantee form a corpse, as well as give you 15% damage reduction upon just using it. The guaranteed corpse spawn is incredibly good for guaranteeing a corpse, so you can instantly proc corpse tendrils on a group of mobs. Corpse tendrils is unbelievably powerful for the build. Because we're using the Grasping Veins on a two-hander, which I'll get more into the reasoning why later, but having Grasping Veins up all the time for not only an 80% increase to our damage against enemies affected by the corpse tendrils, but also permanent 40% increased crit chance. Without this increased crit chance, it's very difficult to get to 100% crit chance. Pretty sure it's almost impossible without Bone Storm being up all the time. And as a result of this, we can better take advantage of all of these crit damage modifiers that we have and all the crit damage that we just have in our stats, right? But also, whenever enemies are affected by corpse tendrils, we just deal extra damage to them, not only because it's a legendary, but also because they count as stunned. So it's very, very good having the Reap, so you can just walk in, form a corpse, and then this corpse is going to automatically get casted via the Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul, which is going to cast the corpse tendrils every 8 seconds. If you have a really good roll, which is almost enough for 100% uptime with Grasping Veins, but as long as you just manually cast the corpse tendrils every now and then, you will have 100% uptime on this crit chance buff. Also, our corpse tendrils will make enemies vulnerable, and we do have a little bit of additional damage via vulnerable enemies, so pretty much anytime there's like a group of really scary elites or even suppressor mobs, you can very easily go in there, pop a Reap, corpse tendril, and then everything will become vulnerable, stunned, and take double the damage effectively. And you can very easily just blast everything in the face. Outside of that, we use Corpse Explosion. This is good for actually multiple different reasons. The main reason is because with Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul, it's going to automatically be casting Corpse Explosion all the time on enemies that you kill. We're spawning corpses all the time with Hued Flesh via the lucky hit, but also just killing enemies. This is going to give us 9% damage with Fueled by Death. I happen to have this on my Amulet, which is not ideal. 9% damage all the time, but namely 40% multiplicative damage almost all the time with Flesh Eater, which is just insanely good. But also, I'm using the modifier where Corpse Explosion becomes a darkness skill, which means that it does damage over time. And as you can see here, if I just put this on the ground, here, let's get a Corpse Explosion to actually spawn via Hued Flesh. So I'm just going to automatically be casting Corpse Explosion all the time with my ring, right? And because it's doing damage over time, it's insanely good for keeping up Disobedience stacked, as you can see here. And it's also just proccing Hued Flesh on its own, because Corpse Explosion has such a high lucky hit chance. So it's literally sitting here, just constantly casting Corpse Explosion, keeping up my Disobedience stacked permanently, which is really strong. All these skills, in my opinion, are pretty much set in stone with the build. There's literally no reason to ever use Bone Splinters. There's no reason for generating Essence, and it's simply just better to use Reap for the guaranteed corpse, as well as the damage reduction upon using it. So don't use Bone Splinters. There's literally no point. I'd recommend using one curse skill. The only downside with this build is the healing, which you can supplement with one of our Vampire Powers, but also Iron Maiden is insane for this. You can just walk up to a group of enemies, put down the curse on them. If you kill 10 guys, you just instantly heal through 70% of your HP, but it also is very good for giving you an Essence cushion. Essence is not a problem with this build at all when you have it set up properly, but this makes it even less of a problem, and being capped out on your Essence is very, very important for your damage because your damage scales off of your maximum Essence so heavily. So Iron Maiden is very, very good for that. Alternatively, Decrepify is also insanely good, so enemies deal less damage to you, and also you constantly have crowd control on enemies, which is good for one of our glyphs. I'd recommend just swapping between the two based on the content that you're doing, but 9 out of 10 times I personally use Iron Maiden because I really like the healing. Then we just have Bone Storm. It's a really long cooldown. We aren't using Lidless Wall, which I will talk about actually because I do think that is a very good version of the build. But for the way I have the build set up, Bone Storm is really just there for additional crit chance and damage reduction whenever I feel like I need it. Mainly for bosses and like really scary situations with a ton of elites. When it comes to skill tree, there's a little bit of variation here. You want to just get Reap for the Acolyte's Reap for the guaranteed corpse spawn anytime that you just press Reap on an enemy. And perfectly balanced for damage. Hued Flesh is very good. You could argue you only need like 1 or 2 points into this, but it's great to just have more uptime on Flesh Eater and the guaranteed corpse spawns against bosses, so that your auto corpse is spawning the corpse tendrils, so when you're fighting bosses, you always have that crit damage modifier active on bosses. It's really good. And it also proc the Flesh Eater buff on bosses with the corpse explosions. Then we go into Paranormal Bone Spear so that we get the additional bone shards. Vulnerable isn't nearly as good as it used to be, and we also will have vulnerable on enemies that actually matter via the Corpse Central's vulnerable modifier. I go into Blighted Corpse Explosion because of the disobedience stacking for consistency and survivability, but if you wanted more damage, you could take the points out. Then I go into 3 points into Fueled by Death for 9% increased damage, 3 into Death's Embrace for damage reduction, and just a little bit of damage against close enemies. Death's Reach is very good for damage, and then I get Abhorrent Iron Maiden for the heal. If you're fighting bosses, 3 points into amp damage is very, very strong, and in which case you could probably just take the points out of Blighted Corpse Explosion and like 1 point out of Hewed Flesh probably. Corpse Centrals for the vulnerable, like I said. For speedrunning, getting Reaper's Pursuit paired with Corpse Explosion Blighted is very good because you pretty much just permanently have 15% increased movement speed. Then you want to get 3 into Serration, Compound Fracture, and Avulsion for damage. 3 into Inspiring Leader for a little bit of attack speed, but this is kind of optional because you have a lot of attack speed via Ravenous. 3 into Standalone for damage reduction, Memento Mori for increased sacrifice bonuses, and then we max out the Bone Storm, and of course we get Ossified Essence. When it comes to our Book of the Dead, for our first sacrifice, we're using the crit chance, which gets increased to 8% crit chance via our sacrifice node in our skill tree. Alternatively, though, using the defenders for the additional resistance is very, very good. But I've set up the build to where I'm at max resistance without this, which ultimately does end up being better because you really need the crit chance for just more consistency. But until you're able to have the build perfectly set up, I would recommend using this so that you can max out your resistances. We sacrifice the Cold Mages for 15% increased damage against vulnerable enemies. 15 Essence is good, but it is not as good as just 15% multiplicative damage anymore because they did nerf Ossified Essence scaling. So this would be 7.5% damage, while this is just 15%. Then of course we sacrifice the Golem for 30% increased crit damage multiplier, which is pretty insane. When it comes to our Vampiric Powers, always use Ravenous. The attack speed is very, very nice, and we also have increased movement speed, so we get about 60% increased value out of this. But if you have movement speed on your Amulet, it would be even more. Undying is pretty much mandatory in my opinion. You have really high attack speed and you're constantly casting Corpse Explosion, so you get a lot of healing with this, and without it your survivability is kind of weak. Metamorphosis at level 1, don't level this up. This is very good for taking advantage of Tibalt's Will, but you don't really need the essence via this, so leveling it up isn't too big of a deal, but we're mainly using it for the 40% increased damage via Tibalt's Will. Sanguine Brace is insanely good for not only survivability, but also the 8% crit chance while you're fortified, which you will be almost all the time in Nightmare Dungeons. And then I have Resilience for Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons, giving you much needed damage reduction, but if you feel like you don't need the damage reduction, you could just swap it to Prey on the Weak. Took me forever to find. You swap this to Prey on the Weak for just 16% increased damage. When it comes to legendaries and uniques, there's a lot of different ways people are setting this up, so let me go over those different variations for you. The first thing that I want to talk about is your helmet slot here, because a lot of people are using Deathless Visage. I just want to say that I don't think that this is worth it. The amount of damage that you get as a result of using this is relatively low, and in my opinion, you would be much better off using a normal legendary helmet with a defensive aspect on it, as well as the total armor that you get out of using a normal legendary helmet for overall way more survivability. You also lose maximum HP and intelligence, which would just be overall more damage than Deathless Visage anyways. Personally, I'm using Harlequin Crest, and a lot of you guys probably have already commented the build only does good damage because you're using Harlequin Crest. But real quick, I want to point out how much value this actually gives you. Mainly, I'm using it for the damage reduction, but also the damage that you get from the +4 ranks of skills. The stats on it are pretty good too. The max HP is very high roll, and it's also the all stats is pretty nice. Resource gen and cooldown reduction aren't really necessary, but they do help out a little bit. The amount of damage that you get from this +4 ranks is actually not all that insane. You go from 153% weapon damage with Bone Spear up to 187%, and if we multiply 153 times 1.22, so a 22% increase, that is 186%. So we're getting roughly a 22 to 23% damage increase from using this, which is really not all that insane. If you're using a normal legendary helmet, you'll get maximum essence to, I believe, about 20, which would be about 10% multiplicative damage via Ossified Essence. So using Harlequin's Crest, I'm really only gaining 10% damage, and I'm gaining a little bit of max HP and damage reduction. But if you're using a normal legendary helmet, you get to retain armor, which is a little bit better for survivability. You get to retain the maximum essence roll, and you get some max HP as well as intelligence. So it's almost as good as using a Harlequin's Crest. I just use this because the damage reduction is up all of the time. Just quickly wanted to go over that. Another thing I want to go over is using a two-handed version of the build versus using Lidless Wall. Lidless Wall I actually think is probably better for like speed farming tier 100s and just playing very, very comfortably. The problem though is that I wanted this build to be good for Abattoir of Zir, and I also wanted it to do as much damage as possible. And it just feels a lot better that way, in my opinion. But Lidless Wall gives you a ridiculous amount of survivability, but you lose a lot of damage by using it. The reason you lose a lot of damage is because it only gives you plus 80% of your main hand weapon damage, so you effectively lose 20% damage there. But also you lose damaging stats on the weapon. You do gain max essence, which is pretty good, but you are going to lose things like intelligence, all stats, as well as a two-handed legendary slot. The benefit of Lidless Wall is that it gives you armor straight up, it gives you block chance, which then gives you 60% block damage reduction. Somebody can do the math on that, maybe that's like 12% effective damage reduction, I don't know. The armor's pretty good, and also you pretty much permanently have Bone Storm active, which gives you 15% damage reduction as well as 20% crit chance. So Lidless Wall is really good, but you just lose somewhere to the effect of like 50% of your damage overall by deciding to use it. It may end up being the case that in Abattoir of Zir you need the survivability and you don't need the damage because you can scale damage with the Tears of Blood glyph, but for now I prefer the damage. But obviously feel free to swap to Lidless Wall, and if you were going to do that, you would simply just play the builds the same way. You just put on a one-hander, probably a sword, to the effect of this with int all stats, crit, something like that, and put Grasping Veins on there, and then you'd put Lidless Wall there. Another question is, why do I have Grasping Veins on the two-hander? This is so that we can have 100% crit chance up almost all of the time. A lot of people use Splintering on the two-hander, which is good because the shards do a lot of your damage, so buffing that is very strong, but this means that you won't have 100% crit chance, which ultimately is a damage loss, and also you get the damage value out of Grasping Veins anyways, which is going to ultimately buff the Splintering bonus. On my Amulet, I have Ossified Essence. I think I'd rather actually have this be Splintering, but overall, I like the consistency. Splintering is more damage if like all 5 shards hit the enemy, which is not always the case, so consistent damage is pretty good, but overall for like bosses and stuff, I do think Splintering on Amulet is probably better than Ossified now that I've done a little bit more testing. Another thing is Tibalt's Will. You lose a little bit of survivability by using this, but you gain 50% increased damage, not only because you get the 40% increased multi all the time, but the plus 20 maximum resource scales your Ossified Essence, which is very strong. Outside of that, for our other legendaries, we're using Disobedience all the time so that we have maximum armor, which I'm at 14k armor right now, which is almost enough for Abattoir, but more than enough for tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons when Disobedience is actually stacked up, and my armor rolls are kind of low on my gear. I have Ghostwalker on the boots for additional movement speed. I have Exposed Flesh, which honestly is not necessary. This is very good for essence generation, but you actually have more than enough essence generation without this, but it's very good for consistency. Ring of Sacrilegious, which I've already talked about, and then, like I mentioned, Ossified on the Amulet. When it comes to rolls on your gear, for a helmet, you want, if you actually were to have one, you'd want total armor percent, intelligence, maximum HP, and then maximum essence, and the armor and the essence are probably the most important there. On the chest, you want armor percent, damage reduction while fortified, which you are permanently via Sanguine Brace, and then I'd probably go max HP instead of damage reduction from distant. On the gloves, you want crit chance, ranks to Bone Spear, lucky hit chance to restore a resource is unbelievably strong, and then instead of crit damage with bone skills, I'd actually prefer to have attack speed. On the pants, you want Tibalt's Will, but if you want to go for more survivability, again, you do lose about 50% damage, but if you want some survivability, just get normal pants. If you're not using Lidless Wall, I'm not sure which legendary you'd put on there, maybe like Aspect or Protector or something like that, and you would just want the same thing as your chest, so armor, damage reduction while fortified, and then max HP. On the boots, you want Attack Reduce Evades cooldown, which is really nice, movement, or you could just get max evade charges. Movement speed is very good, essence cost reduction is very good, damage reduction while injured is pretty nice, and then you can either get movement speed after killing an elite for just more movement speed, or you can get intelligence for just straight up more damage. I tried using Flicker Step for more uptime on Bone Storm for more damage reduction. It's very clunky with Bone Spear, especially because you like to play at range, and you lose a lot of movement speed by using this, but if you want to have more uptime on Bone Storm, kind of like a Lidless Wall, but using a two-hander, Flicker Step is a good way to do that. Then on the two-hander, you want to have a sword because it rolls inherently with crit damage, and it also is a higher attack speed than a scythe. And you want to roll intelligence, all stats, and then ideally core skill damage, or just damage with crits, and then crit damage with bone skills. Getting crit damage is not better than getting an int or all stats. This is a common misconception that crit damage multipliers scale off of your overall crit damage. That is not how that works. This is simply just a multiplier. So the multiplicative value of int and all stats is always going to be better than the crit damage there, as the crit damage is additive. One ring, you want to be Ring of the Sacrilegious and try to get as much of a maximum essence roll as possible, but the main thing that's important is getting as low of a cooldown on Corpse Tendrils as possible, so you have 100% uptime on the crit chance here. And then on your other ring, again, you want to have Exposed Flesh, but honestly, once the build is perfectly set up, this could easily be Edge Masters for just increased damage, because you really do not need the essence at all. And you want to have crit chance, maximum essence, those are the two most important things. And the additive damage value is pretty low here because you have so much additive damage that it's really not going to increase your damage that much. I'd recommend getting either crit or physical, but I would rather have max HP here for survivability, or you could get resource gen, but again, your essence is like not a problem at all. On the amulet here, you want essence cost reduction is very important, and then total armor percent is very good for survivability. And instead of ranks of fueled by death, you actually want compound fracture. Evulsion is good, but it's only against vulnerable, and enemies are not permanently vulnerable anymore because we don't use supernatural bone storm or bone spear. And compound fracture is actually the same as Evulsion because Evulsion got nerfed. So this is pretty much just 15% damage all the time, so I'd recommend getting that. And then you could also get, for higher end content, instead of this damage roll that I have here, you want straight up damage reduction or damage reduction while fortified, or for speed farming content, you would get movement speed. I'll quickly show my stats. As you can see here, I am pretty much exactly capped out on my resistances. The reason for this is because of the way that I have the Paragon board set up, and I have 1 diamond in. You make sure to get 1 diamond in because of the way I have it set up, this will literally cap you on your resistances, and I really wanted to get the extra crit chance via the sacrifice, but if you don't have enough resistance and your Paragon board isn't maxed out, then just go into the defenders for now, and then swap into this later once you have a min-max version of the build. I'll quickly go over the Paragon board. In the first board, I have Sacrificial to buff our armor, as well as give us just 10% multiplicative damage all the time. In the second board, I have Amplify, so we deal 10% increased damage to cursed enemies. This isn't my favorite glyph, but it buffs the resistances here, which I need to get capped at resistance so that we can use the crit damage sacrifice. Then we just fully max out this board for Bone Graft, which gives us increased damage as well as max essence, and we get a ton of maximum essence as well as essence on kill here, which is very, very strong, and straight up damage. I also get some max HP here and some armor. And then I go into the Bloodbath board and just max out essence for 194% increased crit damage. Then I go into the Scent of Death board for either 15% damage reduction or 15% increased damage based on if we have corpses near us or not. And I put Control in here. Control is useless against bosses, but when you're fighting elites, it's very good. 20% increased damage to stunned enemies, which they are stunned via Corpse Tendrils. And also 75% additive damage is pretty decent as well, but you also get some pretty nice armor value here. So overall, pretty happy with that. And then I have Corporeal for 10% increased physical damage, which Bone Spear is a physical damage ability. And this also buffs not only 36% damage to elites, which is very good, but also 6.7% resistance to all elements. And also we get Flesh Eater. Alternatively, you could swap Control to Undaunted for a bit more survivability, so you get 10% damage reduction rather than the 20% multiplicative damage. When it comes to playing with the build, I think it's actually pretty straightforward. This version is a little bit more glass cannon than if you were to use Lidless Wall or if you were to just swap for some survivability-oriented things, which I did mention in the video. But it does end up being pretty tanky and very easy to play with, in my opinion. You pretty much just use Reap if you want some damage reduction via Aspect of Might or just a 15% damage reduction. You spawn the corpse with Reap as well. You get the Corpse Tendrils there. And anytime there's like a massive group of elites, just make sure to Corpse Tendril them manually or wait for the autocast so that they get sucked in. And you can pretty much just blast them and everything will die. Use Iron Maiden when you open up with the pack so that you get the additional damage via cursed enemies. Also so that when you kill them, you get the heal. Otherwise, you pretty much just spam your Bone Spear. Try not to spam it like crazy because you will end up losing a lot of your max essence there, which means you're then going to do a lot less damage. But because we're using Tibalt's Will, you can just spacebar and get almost all of your essence back, as well as just press Iron Maiden. And you're also constantly casting the Corpse Explosion there, which gives you a little bit of essence as well. That's pretty much it for the Bone Spear variation of the build. It does a ridiculous amount of damage. It's pretty easy to play with. If you have any questions about it, leave it down in the comments. Now let's get into the Blood Surge version of the build, which is very good for tier 100s actually. It's not quite as fast as Bone Spear, and the damage output is a bit less. The goal with this build is basically to just have really high attack speed to force proc a lot of overpowers, because you get guaranteed overpowers via Blood Surge itself. and you try to just have as much essence generation as you can to be able to sustain spamming so many blood surges. It's not my favorite playstyle. It's kind of fun. The main downside is that your boss damage is really bad, which is why I would never say it's like the best build or even like an S tier build. The boss damage is simply just too bad for it to be that good, but if you only do nightmare dungeons that are like around your level, or you're just like leveling up, Blood Surge is one of the better builds in the game. And as you can see in the gameplay, I mean, it is pretty good, and I had a good time playing with it. It isn't my favorite thing in the world, but it's nice to play something different, and I'm happy that Blood is actually good. I'm worried that if overpower damage gets nerfed, this build is completely just dead, because it's really, really not that strong. Like, it is good enough, but I would never say it's an S tier build. I'd say this is like a B or A tier build at best. So if overpower damage gets nerfed, that would be a little bit unfortunate. I don't have the build set up on my character anymore, so I'm just going to quickly go over the Mobalytics link that I have for you guys here. And if you have any questions about it, just leave it down in the comments as well. So there's two versions, one of which is with Uber Uniques and the other one is without. I'll just show you guys the one without because it's really not much of a difference. Just with Uber Uniques, you put on Harlequin Crest, and Doombringer is insanely good for just giving you a lot of survivability via max HP and damage reduction, but the non-Uber Unique version is perfectly fine and what most of you guys are going to use. Basically, Blood Surge has a guaranteed overpower proc with the skill tree. Every 5 casts of Blood Surge, you get a guaranteed overpower. You pair this with Banished Lord's Talisman and the key passive, and you're just proccing overpower all the time, and you just scale your overpower damage like out the wazoo, and you just do a crazy amount of damage. I'll quickly go over the skill tree, but this will just be in the description. You get Reap for the guaranteed corpse spawn for corpse tendrils, max out Blood Surge, get some extra damage with Imperfectly Balanced there. Corpse Explosion for Blighted, because I like this with Disobedience. Fueled by Death for some damage. Death's Embrace for damage. Death's Reach for damage. Iron Maiden for the heal. Amplify damage for damage. Alternatively, you could use Decrepify instead of Iron Maiden there. Then we max out a lot of this blood stuff for increased damage, and then Lucky Hit blood skills to have a chance to spawn a Blood Orb. I get Corpse Tendrils here, which makes enemies vulnerable. And then Reaper's Pursuit just for a little bit of mobility because this build feels pretty slow. And then I get Standalone for damage reduction, Memento Mori. We don't need the attack speed because our attack speed is insanely high anyways. Bone Storm just for some crit chance, mainly just for fighting bosses. And then Rathma's Vigor, which just gives you some guaranteed overpower procs every once in a while. And picking up Blood Orbs reduces the effective cooldown of this. So you get some Blood Orbs with Transfusion, so you just have more uptime on Rathma's Vigor there. For my sacrifices, I had to go for the resistance sacrifice here because there just wasn't a good enough way to get the resistance with the way I wanted to set up this Paragon board. So that's fine. I lose a little bit of crit chance, but not a big deal. And then you get the overpower damage multiplier and then the crit damage multiplier as we are critting with our overpowers all the time. And we also deal double the damage if we crit while it's an overpower, which is our main goal here. On our helmet, we want to have a normal legendary with Aspect of Might, total armor, max HP, int, cooldown reduction is good. The cooldown reduction isn't really all that necessary. You get resource, or not resource gen. I don't know what else you get, actually. It doesn't really matter. Maybe max essence, but cooldown reduction is fine. On the helmet, you want Disobedience with armor, damage reduction, DR while fortified, and max HP. On the gloves, you want crit chance, ranks of blood surge, overpower damage, and lucky hit chance to restore resource is really good for consistency. Debalt's Will is mandatory, paired with Metamorphosis rank 1. This is very, very good for your essence generation, which is the biggest problem with the build. Ghostwalker Aspect is mandatory for movement speed, in my opinion. And then you get movement speed, essence cost reduction, more movement speed, and DR on the boots. And then on the one-hander, you can just use Edgemaster's Aspect for extra damage, or you can use Doombringer, and you want int, all stats, overpower damage, and core skill damage. On the offhand, you want Grasping Veins for the crit chance, as well as the crit damage multiplier against enemies that are corpse tendrilled. And you're constantly corpse tendrilling because you're using Ring of the Sacrilegious, and also manually casting corpse tendril. And you do have a little bit of cooldown reduction with the build, so that's pretty nice. And then on the offhand, you want crit chance, int, all stats, and then essence cost reduction. On your other ring, you just want crit chance, max HP, resource gen, and overpower damage. The overpower damage doesn't really matter because the additive damage value is pretty low, but it is helpful. And the crit chance is just really good because we do deal a lot of extra damage when we actually do crit. For our vampire powers, we're going for Undying for the healing, Metamorphosis to pair with Debalt's Will, Sanguine Brace for all the time Fortify, which increases our damage but also crit chance, Resilience for damage reduction, which could be Prey on the Weak instead, or Bloodbath, and then Ravenous for movement speed, which I think is mandatory. And lastly, we have the Paragon board, which I kind of sweated out here. We got Amplify for increased damage, but it also is going to buff the armor here, which is really nice because we need that armor. Also, I know that this is giving you guys eye aids. It gives me eye aids too. They're actually going to fix this, so thank God. The colors here are a little rough, and they're going to fix that, so that's awesome. But for now, we must suffer. So we're going to go into this board to get a lot of extra overpower damage here, which is really good. And we also max out Dominate, which gives us a crazy amount of overpower damage. And then I dip into this board for some Essence on Kill and Max Essence, which actually is really good and scales with Essence generation. And then we go into the other board here, Bloodbath for 35% increased multiplicative overpower damage. And I get Territorial for some damage reduction. There's also some overpower damage here, which is sick. And some resistance to all elements, which we need to be able to cap. Then we have Scent of Death, so we get damage reduction and damage, and we buff up our Sacrificial, so we just deal 10% increased damage, which then buffs up the armor nodes here, and then we get even more armor, so we're capped out on our armor. And then I go into the Flesh Eater board for 40% increased multiplicative damage, which is up almost all the time, which is why I am using the Ring of the Sacrilegious for just 40% increased damage all the time, as well as the Corpse Tendrils casting, so I get the crit chance there. That's really good for that. And then I get Undaunted for the damage reduction while fortified, and we get some resistance to all elements there. The way that you play Blood Surge is fairly similar to Bone Spear. You're kind of just melee Bone Spear, and you're just right-click spamming like a psychopath. The main thing is you want to just make sure to spam spacebar as much as possible, Corpse Tendril on cooldown, and you end up just killing a lot of stuff. It's pretty fun to play with, but the overall damage is lacking, and your boss damage ends up really not being all that good. Sorry for the video being insanely long, but hopefully for those of you guys that wanted to see both builds and see just the pros and cons between them, hopefully you did enjoy. And I spent a lot of time on the Blood Surge build, and I was kind of disappointed that it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be, but it kind of ended up being as good as it really could be, right? There just isn't really a way to save that build because of the way that the overpower procs work. So hopefully they don't nerf it too much, but it is a lot of fun to play with. Anyways, leave any questions down below if you have any. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.